I wish you a wonderful day and welcome to the Excel YouTube channel. In this video, we'll talk about how we can use configuration files with NFTables and how the logging basically works. Let's get into it. Here we are back on our demo environment. As we've seen in the last videos, we have one main configuration file by default. Let's take a look at its contents again. Yeah, this is the very basic default rule set. So what can we do with the NFTables configuration file or files? It depends on how complex your rule set will be once you really start to configure your system. If you already know that your rule set will stay pretty simple and small, you might as well just use the default configuration file to configure it all and be done. Keep it simple. But if you already know that your rule set will get complex, you might need multiple tables or many variables, then it can make sense to split up the configuration into multiple files, into multiple configuration files. I personally like this approach because it helps you stay organized and keep an overview over your configuration. Also, it helps with debugging it. Now, how can we use multiple configuration files with NFTables? First, we'll have to create a configuration directory that will contain all of those configuration files. In our case, we create the directory etc nft-conft. Now, let's take a look at the permissions, default permissions of those, the default configuration and the new configuration directory. We can, of course, remove the permissions for other users than root to read that configuration, because there's no need that other users on that system should be able to read that configuration. Okay, permissions look good. Now we can create our first configuration file in our configuration directory. In our case, we will transfer the default rule set into a new configuration file, the test.conf in our case. We will remove the flush rule set from our sub configuration file because we only want to add the flush rule set inside our main configuration file, so it only gets executed once. Else we might have some major issues if you flush our rule set in between configuration files. And now we include all .conf files inside our configuration directory. Yeah. If that configuration directory does not exist, NFTables will not warn you, so be aware of that. Configuration validation works, so looks good. If we now reload the configuration, the running rule set should look the same as before. Exactly. That's how it should look. As we have mentioned in the last videos, the default policy accept is visible in the runtime configuration, but is not included by default in the configuration file. We will now add it explicitly to the configuration file so it is clear that this default policy is applied. In the following videos, we will go into some more advanced setups where we actually utilize multiple configuration files. For now, we'll leave it like that. Now, let's take a look at the logging behavior of NFTables. As we are here on Debian and running systemd, we can view the NFTables service logs using the journal.zl. We will now add a very basic test rule that will drop and log some traffic. In our case, we will just add a generic drop rule to the input chain. In that case, we will drop traffic to the port 8080 and add a log prefix before the log message. Now I have a syntax error in this rule because the action, the drop in this case, needs to be at the end. Now we have to reload our configuration to activate it, and if we then connect to that specific port we have blocked, we see some drop logs. We are viewing those logs using the channel without any filters here. We can also see that those drop logs are logged under the application kernel. This is because the actual firewall is running in kernel space. Of course, not only NFTables logs are logged under the application kernel. We also don't see those drop logs in the application NFTables. So this makes manual troubleshooting on that system a little harder. What can we do about it? I personally like to use the rsyslog application to separate those NFTables logs from the kernel logs and write them to a dedicated log file. I personally would always recommend to use a central log system, a log server, to send all of those logs to, just in case some attacker penetrates your infrastructure and takes over your systems, because those logs on that source system can be modified or deleted. Also, a central log system can analyze and process those logs and even give you a visual overlook over whatever traffic is blocked, and if some unusual traffic is blocked, can even alert you automatically. I personally can recommend Greylog Open for such operations. To configure this dedicated log file, we'll first have to install rsyslog and logrotate. In our case, we already pre-installed those packages. After that, we will create two configuration files, one for rsyslog and one for logrotate. The rsyslog configuration file will be our first, and this configuration file tells rsyslog which logs to write into our dedicated log file. We basically filter all logs by the program name, kernel, and also check that the logs need to contain the NFT keyword. This NFT keyword will be configured on all log prefix statements in the NFTables config. You can of course use some other keyword, but you'll have to configure that keyword on your log prefixes. Now let's restart rsyslog to load that configuration. And afterwards we can check, is the log file there? Does it exist? In that case it will not exist yet, because no log has been redirected to that file. But if we produce one drop log, it gets created and we see exactly that drop log is written in the dedicated NFTables log file. This can also, of course, be handy to tail current drops, as we can view it in real time. Yeah, then after that we'll create the lockRotate configuration file. LockRotate will make sure that the log file doesn't grow endlessly. In our case, we will rotate the log file daily and keep 7 days worth of logs. You can, of course, change that to whatever count you need. Yeah, okay. Then restart lockRotate to activate that configuration, and we're good to go. We have our dedicated log file set up. Also important to know, if you're running NFTables inside a container, a LXC container, you will have to install the ulogd2 application to redirect the logs to a specific log file. Also, you will have to define the group 0 behind every log prefix statement. Then you can also redirect those NFTables logs inside the container. It's a little bit more complicated because, of course, the host and container share their kernel, and thus the kernel logs get merged. This is the end of this video. In the next one, we will go into how rules are configured, how we can configure logging inside the NFTables rule set, and also how to use variables. So, if you're interested, keep watching the playlist, and for now, have a nice day. Servus.